Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. So today we have a presenter with us, Jose Vieira, and he will be presenting the webinar, More Than Numbers, the Relationship Between Data and Disability Policy. So I'd first like to say that when entering the webinar, when the webinar is in session, please mute your microphones and try to keep the video off. And during or after the sessions, please unmute your microphone and use the hands raised function or the box to provide your feedback or questions. And if you can please refrain from using the chat function, because we have some participants using the screen reader and it interferes with that function. So if you can please refrain from that and use the chat function in the end during our discussional portion. I see that we have one raised hand. If you can unmute your mic and go ahead.
Etienne, did you have a question or comment? Your hand is up. Okay, maybe not.
Maybe not. Okay, never mind. All right, so we'll go on to introducing our presenter and our topic for today. So a major barrier to realizing the Sustainable Development Goals for persons with disabilities is the lack of complete data on people with disabilities. The disability data gap prevents the development of disability inclusive policy at global and national levels. And in addition to the fragmented data, the COVID-19 pandemic has also blocked the flow of disability data. The question now is, what are the roles of organizations of persons with disabilities in disability data collection? How can data be collected that portrays the diverse needs of disabled people? What principles and ethical considerations should be involved in this vital work? And how might it be implemented to reflect these considerations? So these are all really important questions that we need to ask ourselves if we want to continue with disability research. So our presenter today is Mr. Jose Vieira. So hi, Jose, we're really glad that you can join today. Mr. Jose Vieira is the Chief Executive Officer of the World Blind Union since April 2018. He is also the permanent representative of the Stakeholders Group of Persons with Disabilities. Previously, he was the World Blind Union Human Rights Policy Advisor for 2 years, supporting more than 100 different national associations of the blind to promote inclusivity for blind people all over the world. He has served as a consultant for the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Committee Secretariat. Mr. Viera has 20 years of experience working nationally and internationally in the field of disability inclusivity and advocacy. We're very excited to have him speak today about his work and experience in disability advocacy. So on to you, Lynn, if you'd like to give some background information on our topic today.
Thank you, Liba. My name is Lynn Coburn, and I'm one of the coordinators of the Pearl Project. I'm based in Hamilton, Ontario. And it is my pleasure to be giving you a little bit of background before we move into Mr. Vieira's presentation. So there is a long history and continuing ongoing work on the development of how to measure disability. Many people in our Pearl network have been learning about disability measures in various ways. In our research project, we are using the Washington Group short set of questions, which many of you will know is good practice, but it's only one of the ways of measuring or collecting data on disability. So we're really recognizing the work of Dr. Sophie Mitra and the teams that she works with. And today's presentation builds on and responds to recent work that they've done. So before moving on to Jose's talk, we just thought it would be helpful to give a little bit of background, a few reminders. So we know that disability is not one thing. We recognize that disability is complex, it's variable, The question of how to measure disability has been around for many decades now. And at the country level, there have been different approaches used to develop disability prevalence statistics. So sometimes household surveys are used. Sometimes there's a question in a population census. There are different strategies that can be used. And then in specific research projects and with organizations, organizational policy, there might be a more complex or longer kind of approach. So you might have more questions. The Washington group has an extended set, and they also have a long set with many more questions. We know that interviewing people and getting their lived experience can be really important to understand disability. And I think where we're at in many ways is that there's no one single approach that is always right across the board. It really depends on the context. So some people ask, do you have a disability? That's a question that sometimes shows up in research studies, in some census documents. But we're also starting to hear about functional difficulties. So, which doesn't even include the word disability. Functional difficulty, meaning that there's an impairment to seeing or hearing or some other body function. There's also discussion about activities of daily living. And there's also discussion about broad activity limitations. So things like being unable to go to work due to a health condition. So there's a lot of different terminology and concepts, and we're looking forward to having some discussion about these today. Laba, if you could just go, yeah. So what's new is that Dr. Mitra and her team just recently released a very large study that they've done, which indicates that persons with disabilities are often invisible in national data sets. So despite all the effort that has been made, there is still a lack of good data collection. What they did was that they reviewed national censuses and surveys and the specific questions in those data collection methods. They looked at 133 low and middle income countries from 2009 to 2018. They reviewed 734 discrete data sets for a total of 1,297 data set years. And in all of that, they found that less than a third of those data sets had disability related questions. And only 50% of the countries had a functional, a question related to functional difficulty. And only 15% of the data sets had a question related to functional difficulty that met the international standards. So we now know that this is a problem. And the question is, what do we need to do? Jose has been very involved in these discussions, has given a lot of thought. And so we're really pleased that you're here with us today, Jose, and you can help us move forward with this. Please go ahead.
All right, so good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Let me first thank Lynn and her team for having me today. Before we go into the topics of today's presentation, I really want to highlight the need of projects like the one that Lean is leading. And I say this basically because if in order to further advance the disability rights agenda, we have conclusively shown that partnership with other civil society organizations, of course, partnering with other organizations of people with disabilities, are definitely an excellent tools for promoting the right of people with disabilities. At the same time, um, ensuring that governments are held accountable for what they are responsible according to the different international instruments is another great resource to ensure that our human rights agenda is considered. But I don't think that we have done enough, and maybe this is an open reflection to think about with regards to what other actors can be involved in advancing our human rights agenda. So projects like the one that Lynn and her team are leading is definitely an example of how much is needed to have a broader approach when it comes to who can participate, but at the same time, how inclusive we should be when incorporating other views in our discussions around the disability rights movement. So I really want to take this opportunity to thanks Lean for leading the project and for making it in line with many of the CRPD principles, if not all of them. And that means being participatory, inclusive, and accessible, as just to mention a few. So, getting into the topic, I really want to start by sort of not, I don't think that we would have to make a long explanation of what has brought us here, but maybe I think it's very much needed at this point before we get into the data related discussion to mention, at least for me, a number of important elements that had increasingly impacted in the realization of a need for more and better quality data for people with disabilities. And the first component of this is the shift from a advocacy strategy based on our experience to what we can call evidence-based advocacy strategy. Maybe not for countries like Canada or some European developed countries, but in general, in particular, those low and mid income level countries, many of the disability related data has never been important. And because of that, the advocacy strategy that many of our organizations had to put in place was based on what we believed it was needed for people with disabilities. Of course, we were not far from the reality because organizations of people with disabilities were mostly at the front in terms of promoting the inclusion of persons with disabilities. And the fact that in many countries, the absence of the government made organizations of people with disabilities almost the only space or the only place where people with disabilities could go and ask for services, made OPDs to play a significantly important role. However, most of our advocacy strategy were based on what we thought it was needed. For instance, um, if you look at different disability movements, you can easily see what I'm trying to say by, for instance, taking the Blind movement, because many of our organizations understood, received the clear demands from our constituencies that the top priorities were employment, access to education. You can clearly see how the blind movement around the world has actually made over the last 50 years an increasingly important progress in achieving even more rights related to employment and education. However, the fact that most of our organizations had focused our work regarding employment for people with visual impairments or access into education for people with disabilities or visual disabilities didn't necessarily mean that other areas of the life of people with disabilities also affected blind and partially sighted people. For instance, the fact that personal assistance, assistive technology, things like that, were not at the beginning at the core of our advocacy work was actually because mainly we assumed what the most important topics were. And based on those assumptions, we designed our advocacy strategy. So I would say that approximately 20 to 25 years ago, organization of people with disabilities started to realize that was not longer enough to actually build our advocacy strategies based on what we thought it was needed. And at the same time, and especially because many of the developing countries went through a transformation when it comes to public policy systems and basically budget allocations as a result of the 90s globalization process, we can also uh, see that those years were the years in which organization of people with disabilities, along with realizing that there was a further need to move from belief to evidence, we also had to start interacting with other stakeholders. It was not longer enough, although we always had, I think we still have, and we will have for long time, a focus on advocacy in relation to social development ministries or to health ministries. Starting in the late 90s, but even more emphatic in the last 10 to 15 years, organization of people with disabilities realized that they also had to expand their advocacy strategy if they wanted to be effective and successful in promoting the social inclusion of persons with disabilities. So, when organization of people with disabilities realized this new need of talking to more and new people and having to move from beliefs to evidence, we understood that data collection was critical to advance our human rights. And let me put clear examples, or I would say more than clear, like daily examples of what I'm trying to say here. You know that in many low and mid income level countries, transportation is a big issue. And of course, I'm not saying that transportation is not an issue for more developed nations, but definitely in those more developed nations, you can clearly find or easily find alternative solutions. While in less developed countries, the transportation is not only an issue, but it's a way of clear barrier for accessing health, education, social life, sports, recreation, etc., etc. But let me use transportation as an example of what I'm trying to say here. Before, we always uh, thought and assumed that transportation was very much needed, right? But the lack of evidence and the lack of data resulted in that many countries had put in place transportation related policies which actually caused even a more negative impact on people with disabilities. And let me use one concrete example. You know that for many developing countries, when it comes to employment for people with disabilities, many governments have imposed what is called the quota system. So certain percentage of public servant jobs should be allocated to people with disabilities. So in some countries, that percentage run from 0.2% up to 4%, etc., etc. So in those countries where quota systems were in place and a lack of deep research and data collection process took place, some policymakers assumed that those 5% was a percentage that can be replicated across other public policies. So there are some countries where you can see that transportation also has this quota of the 5% incorporated as a way of including people with disabilities. In other words, there are many countries that require the 5% of public buses should be accessible for people with disabilities. It is really funny to see that in some cases, Organization of Persons with Disabilities had conducted studies that are proving that if we have this 5% of public transportation buses be accessible for people with disabilities, for a student living in a city and willing to go to university, would be able to go from his house to the university on Monday and return on Thursday, because only 5% of buses were required to be accessible, and that 5% represents that the student had to leave home to go to the university on Monday and only be able to return home on a Thursday afternoon. So you can clearly see through that very simple example how a important, very important is to have data. B, the need for moving away from the assumption or the belief approach. And C, starting to analyze what would be the role that organization of people with disabilities can play in the field of data collection or data and statistics. So now, another component to this discussion was that those organizations of people with disabilities that managed to quickly realize how important was to collect data, some of them even went one step further and made a connection between the need for data, but actually understanding that many of those OPDs are even organizations generating data, especially those organizations of people with disabilities that are running programs for persons with disabilities, programs such as rehabilitation services, education services, support systems, etc., where at the same time of being organizations of persons with disabilities providing services, advocating for the right of people with disabilities, were data generating hubs. And that is another crucial layer that many OPDs realized that it could play a big role when advocating for data disaggregated when when we talk about persons with disabilities. The other element that I would like to add on top of this is that those organizations of persons with disabilities that quickly realized the need for more data and started to advocate for more data and maybe realized that they can generate data that can be used not only by the organizations but by policymakers, those organizations quickly understood that their interlocutors were not longer exclusively the ministries of health and social development, but National Statistics Office, as well as the centralized data collection agencies, were the target of our advocacy strategy. But what was the main issue when we started to interact with those new stakeholders? That first, the language that we had to use for implementing our advocacy strategy had to significantly change to a statistician language, if may I say. B is that we had to make the right orientation in the advocacy process to realize and to help others to realize that data collection is not only for the sake of compiling information around people with disabilities, but it was critically important that in places where there was some data collection processes taking place, those informations were transferred to the appropriate policymaker within, for instance, the Ministry of Health or Education or Social Development. And third, along with realizing the change, realizing the transferability from data collection to action through policy reforms, the third element was how OPDs will benefit from data. So let me now start by the last point, which is how OPDs will benefit from data collection. Well, before responding to that question, we asked ourselves what capacities OPDs required to be in a better position when interacting with issues related to data. And what we found out is that there had been almost nothing, not to say, I would rather say very little when it comes to capacity building initiatives around data for organizations of persons with disabilities. Organizations of persons with disabilities were always seen as those organizations that wanted to have more social protection system, bigger supports in place. But what happened if we wanted to know what is the percentage or the ratio between persons with and without disability in a specific industry of a country? So to know those things, we first, as persons with disabilities, had to learn A, how to manipulate data, B, how to collect data, C, how to advocate for governments to collect data, and adding all these three components, how we were going to use data for our advocacy initiatives. Responding to the first question or to the first element, how we can use data, there has been a lot of efforts made from the UN system, also by many interested INGOs, like at least one that World Union works very closely with, which is the CBM Global Disability Inclusion, that has produced a toolkit on data for persons with disabilities and their representative organizations. But we really needed to learn how to manipulate and use the data produced. Second, we managed to, and I was pleased to hear that this project uses Washington Group set of questions, because knowing the limitations that the Washington Group set of questions has, it is definitely the best tool we have so far for data collection, especially under the social inclusion model of the disability. And the Washington Group set of questions is the tool that we can clearly tell governments they can use for the collection of disaggregated data for persons with disabilities. So, along with toolkits produced by international organizations and UN agencies, the fact that we do have a set of questions like the one from the Washington Group enabled persons with disabilities and their representative organizations to A, be more prepared when it comes to data collection and data generation, and B, advocating more effectively with governments around the collection of data and statistics. Now, the missing piece here is how we can transform those resources that are coming in terms of training or capacity building exercise and the need for more advocacy with regards to governments. So, in other words, how we are going to use the information that we collect in terms of um, transforming that in an advocacy and in an effective advocacy strategy. One, I think we need more of projects like the one that we are, or that at least I've been invited today to participate in. We definitely need to raise awareness among OPDs and academia and researchers around the need of data when it comes to disability. B, we need to reorient some of our advocacy strategies when it comes to convincing other government agencies on the importance of collecting data and data disaggregated for persons with disabilities. And C, trying to redefine our advocacy strategies based on evidence. And I know that that is one of the most tricky piece of redefining our advocacy strategy, because for that to take place, we need first to let the believed based advocacy strategy go. As long as we continue basing our advocacy on I believe, I think this is what we need, my experience tells me that this is the most critical element, we will be lacking of concrete, objective, and evidence-based approach when it comes to advocacy. Of course, we cannot ignore that most of our um, advocacy priorities are coming from a factual live experience as persons with disabilities, but it is increasingly more important to um, be accompanying this life experience with more data. And I would like to close at least this first short intervention by saying that COVID-19 crisis has shown how important data collection was. And I'm not saying anything new because data collection has always been important. But COVID-19 has shown how creative we must be when collecting data for persons with disabilities. For instance, if we knew what was the statistic about websites accessibility, we could have prevented from happening situations where people with disabilities were left behind because they were not able to access online resources. If we knew with accuracy what were the needs of persons with disabilities by gender, geographic location, level of education, possibility of accessing health centers, the recovery emergency plans put in place by many governments, including those from the global north, could have been more successful. So the COVID-19, along with many things that has reminded us from how far we are when it comes to disability inclusion, in particular, when it comes to data, COVID-19 pandemic has shown not only what we need, but actually how little we have done around data. So definitely looking back, I think the main milestone was to realize the need for data. The second big achievement was to realize that OPDs have a role to play in the data world. But looking into the future, we need more capacity building exercise for organizational persons with disabilities, and we need further investment in how we are going to advocate once we have full control over the manipulation and use of data and statistics. I'll stop here and I'll turn over to Dean, and of course, happy to respond to any question, but actually even more interested to hear other views. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jose. It's so interesting to hear your perspective on this. And thank you for the kind words about the work that we're trying to do as well, because this has been a long-standing concern for me, that we need to have more strong data. So of course, I have lots of comments, questions, but I'd like to open it to anyone who is with us today. Feel free to unmute yourself. You can put up your hand if you'd like in some way, or you can type your question in the chat now. We would ask that you identify yourself just briefly, where are you joining us from? What's your organization? What's your interest in this topic? So would anyone like to start off the discussion? Okay, let me just ask, are we in agreement? Do you think that what Jose has said is controversial in any way? Okay, I'm not seeing anyone unmuting themselves or suggesting things. So Jose, I'm going to ask you to continue on with one of the points that you left off with, which is that organizations of people with disabilities have a strong role to play in this area. And yet we know that there are many, many things pulling on their time and their resources. So what are your specific strategies, I guess, to encourage OPDs or ODPs? I'm used to using a different acronym. To actually get started. Like, imagine an organization that has not been used to having strong data collection. Where would they start?
No, thank you, Lynn. So also, I think another important question that I would really be keen on hearing your voices and views, of course, is that if the data collection issue is an issue exclusively for global South countries, or it's also for global North, is equally needed data for persons with disabilities in Canada, if I can use the example of Canada versus, I don't know, my home country, Argentina. To what extent governments from less developed nations actually can fulfill that obligation of data when there is a general lack of reliable data and statistic in many nations, right? So I think we can address at some point, or at least if it's not today, I would like to leave you all with that question. Is it an issue of of developing countries? Is it an issue that also affects people with disabilities living in the European Union, Canada, Japan, or Australia? But going back to your question, Lynn, I think um, definitely partnership is it's is the key word that I would like to use in my response. And I would connect that to the SDG number 17, which basically speaks to the need of partnership. Um, I think many organizations of people with disabilities have always been with a high pressure in firstly trying to solve the issues that governments were not able to solve, right? So if if I don't have a service that I needed to live an independent life, where do I go? I usually go to my peers. And where do I find my peers? In OPDs or communities organizations. So the fact that there has always been a high pressure on an organization of people with disabilities in handling issues of persons with disabilities, that sometimes made us um, work on the urgent than on the over the important things. So a first good exercise to start with is, of course, we have to continue providing services, especially where the government is not offering the services. But we also need to understand how important it is to start allocating some, even limited, but some resources through volunteer program, partnerships, etc., around data. The second is what what is the role that we want to play? For instance, the World Blind Union, it is clear that we do not expect to be a data generating organization, and neither do we a what I'm trying to say, we are not gonna be advocating with governments because we are a global organization. But what we can do is to support our national members, the Association of the Blind in different countries, for them to advocate with the governments for an appropriate and effective data collection process. So I think where we want to stand when it comes to the data discussion is, for me, the second step. And the third step is actually moving away from a comfort zone. Our comfort zone has always been to interact with other human rights organizations, civil society organizations, service providers, ministries of health, social protection, social development, gender and disability, which is fantastic, very much needed, and we definitely have to continue doing that. But the question is, how many of us in the last 12 months have interacted with national statistic offices? How many of us, or how many of our organizations have written a letter to the municipal data department to ask for simple information such as how many traffic lights are accessible for people with disabilities in your town? So is that an information that can be provided by the Disability Commissioner? No. That information is within the Ministry of, I don't know, urban planning, transportation, And that's where we have to go. So I would say that those are the some of the ideas that I have when it comes to promoting data.
So thank you. So if I'm hearing you correctly, one of the things that you're saying is that organizations like the World Blind can provide some guidance. You mentioned the CBM toolkit as well, but I guess for smaller organizations or more local organizations, that they could really look for toolkits, work that's been done, so that they're not starting from scratch or from the beginning, that they're building on what's already been done. And organizations like the World Blind Union can provide some consistency across countries and projects and things. Is that basically what you're saying?
Yes, yes, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Any other comments? Questions? I know we've had a few people had to, like, the connections aren't great, so they've dropped and then they've joined again. Habib, go ahead, please. We're having trouble hearing you. Can you come a little bit closer to your microphone, please?
Okay. Good day, everyone. Well, now, is it better?
Not really. Can a little bit more, please?
Good day, everyone.
Yeah, I think we can hear you now. Yeah.
You can hear me now.
Let's try.
Okay. Well done. Thanks for the beautiful presentation. I'm a physiotherapist. I'm from Nigeria, and I've been into disability advocacy for quite a while. I've learned so much from the presentation you just made, and truly, they're open-minded to some things, in the sense that we all think we know what they want without really asking questions. So many governments around the world thinks for them, believing the people with disability are unable to think, to probably come up with what they actually need, believing, okay, he can't see, he doesn't know what around. So the government fail to ask questions. Even when they ask questions, they ask 1, 2, and they generalize that maybe that's what everyone needs, which is really, really, really bad. And at the forefront of statistic publications, data publications, sorry. At the forefront of data publications in the national data, disability stat is usually put at the fallback. It's not usually bring to the forefront of discussion. So when policies are made, they make the policy, and at the end of the policy, they now reserve few minutes or few lines for people with disability, which is really, really bad. And as a person, as a physiotherapist, I believe that disability and the number of people with disabled keeps increasing, in the sense that aside juvenile disability, disability born from childbirth, there are other forms of acquired disability too, which also need to be put in consideration when discussing disability issue generally. But just as you rightly said, is like, I'm from Nigeria, it's really, really difficult sometimes, even for people without disabilities, to probably get some data. How much more those disabled organizations, they usually are the disadvantage, in the sense that voluntary organization comes to make donations. Like, a lot of time I've seen on the screen, people making donations to disabled organizations and giving them wheelchair. A lot of time, the kind of wheelchair they even give them are not the one that is suitable for them. They don't ask them questions. They just go to the market. They just acquire some form of wheelchair, crutches, white canes, and just believe that's what they need. And they come on the screen and they celebrate donation to the organization, which a lot of time I feel bad for them, because they refuse to ask questions about what they need and what they want. But be as it be, my question to you is, do we have an international support network that can really push for data connection, not data collection, sorry, not in the sense of country by country, but like something that can go with regions and that can actually support low income countries like Nigeria, like Botswana, like Zimbabwe, like a lot of African countries as a whole. Because if you check around African countries, the stat about disability is really not the true reflection of what's on ground. It's just like you mentioned earlier, too, it's better in developed countries. Even though I also still believe that developed countries, a lot of them have the same problem with even less developed countries when it comes to disability issue. But there's a way they probably push it forward as if they have a true reflection of what they're going through. But I believe no, it's not. I believe the problem is much more endemic. It's even much more in the system. Because how many?
Thank you, Habib. So I think your question is, do we have an international network that can really push for data collection, disaggregated information about different types of disabilities, following good standards? Is that what you're asking? If there's an international network about that? Jose, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't think there is one single organization doing that, but rather many organizations, and that I think that is great, that are doing different type of work. So definitely the first organization that I would like to refer to is the International Disability Alliance, IDA, who may be a known organization for some of you. Also, under the Stakeholder Group of Persons with Disabilities, the United Nations Stakeholder Group of Persons with Disabilities, we have a specific working group on data, which you can join if you like to. And there are some other organizations. Well, actually, not as an organization, but the project that Lean is leading on is actually a big piece of what we need to do from bottom to top when it comes to data collection. But yeah, those would be my suggestions.
And I would add, following the work of Sophie Mitra, which of course is connected to the stakeholder group, I think, right?
Yep.
And the Washington group. And there's a few other people who are doing some interesting work about the real nuts and bolts of data collection. And not everybody is excited about having these conversations about, when it gets into the specifics. But I guess one of the things that I'm hearing you say, Jose, and maybe Habib also, is that every organization should have at least one or two people keeping up with what's happening and can be part of these international organizations and projects.
Yeah, definitely. I think, and if it cannot be done in-house through partnerships, I'm sure there are a lot of opportunities.
Right. So there are people who are doing work that organizations can partner with. Habib, does that address your question?
Yeah, thank you.
That's great. I guess another one that I would think about, sometimes the professional associations also have a stake in data collection. So you're a member of the physiotherapy profession. There's probably an active group in Nigeria, and we know that the World PT Congress Association is doing some work as well. Yeah. Okay. Any other comments before we wrap up? Okay, I saw one comment that your comments, Jose, your points reflect the situations faced in Cameroon. So thank you for that. All right, so thank you very, very much for this very thought-provoking presentation. You've given us some ideas of other conversations that we can have going forward. And so we will continue to think about that, and we'll probably invite you back in a few months to continue on one of these paths and go a little bit deeper. One of the ones that I think about, I would love to hear more about what's happening in the World Blind Union and with other associations of people with vision impairments and people who are blind, specifically about some of the data collection strategies that can be used to get to people as much as we know we need to. So I think that would be an interesting discussion to have as well. Okay, back to you, Laiba.
Thank you, Lynn. So yeah, thank you, Jose, for such a great presentation on such an important topic. I would like to give a few announcements. So the first thing is that I'm going to put a survey in the chat. If you all can just give your feedback for this webinar within that survey. It'll take just like a few minutes, hopefully, and it'll help us develop these webinars in a way that everyone can learn something from. And another thing is that we have another webinar coming up on September 20th, and that topic is really interesting. It's about climate change and disability, which I think is very relevant to the politics that in like the world that we're seeing right now. We see so many different changes in the world, and a lot of them are relating to climate change, and how that intersects with disability is a very it's a very new topic, and it's very relevant for all of us at Pearl. And so I hope everyone can join us for that. It will be on September 20th, 12:30 Toronto time, 5:30 Cameroon time, same time for all of our webinars. And yeah, so let me just put the survey in here in the chat. And second.
Thanks, Laiba. And while you're doing that, I'll just remind people that recordings of our past webinars and this one as well will be up on the Pearl
YouTube channel, yeah.
site. And it usually takes us a few days to get them up, but they are there. If you have ideas for other topics for webinars, please let Laiba know.
Yeah, and also if anyone is new to the webinars and wants to be a part of the Pearl network for newsletters and to be a part of the mailing list, I'll just add the Pearl email in the chat as well, and then you can email us and we'll add you on. So we have newsletters that are coming out, and they'll have all of the information about Pearl and any future webinars and opportunities if you'd like to be involved. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Jose, again, for such a great presentation. And thank you to the participants for being here today, even through internet problems and other difficulties. So yeah.